and welcome to day 2 of dotConnect24, hosted by dotCMS, a virtual conference bringing together marketing, development, technology, and IT professionals. My name is Ina Bosenko. I'm VP of Marketing here at dotCMS, and today we have a full day packed for you with learning and networking opportunities and sessions designed for both content and editorial, and also development and technology professionals. Each session is labeled by who it might be most interesting for, but of course, you're welcome to attend all the sessions of the day. Kicking off today, we have a keynote presentation from our very own VP of Product, Preston So, and he's going to take you into the new era of CMS, the Universal CMS.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of dotConnect. I'm Preston So, VP of Product at dotCMS, and it's my pleasure to kick off today with the keynote about Universal CMS and the new era of content management, where content management is headed in the future, and where dotCMS fits into the puzzle of all of that today. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you all so much for joining us for dotConnect. Just introduce myself very briefly. I am Preston So. I've worked for 17 years in the CMS space. I'm the author of 4 books, both for developers and also for content practitioners. And I've also worked with CMSs the world over and across a variety of different places in the equation of CMS, at places like Oracle and Acquia, and managing large CMS implementations at places like Time Inc. So real pleasure to be here. Please feel free to get in touch with me at preston.so@dotcms.com or on LinkedIn. Just to give you a quick overview, we've got some amazing customers, some great folks with us here at the dotCMS platform. It's a real pleasure to have some of you with us here today, and also to hear some of your stories over the course of this conference as well. Just a quick glimpse at our architecture here. This is the dotCMS platform illustrated in a very sort of quick and easy way for those of us to look at. It's not meant to be comprehensive, but it does illustrate some of the things that dotCMS excels at, namely around multi-site implementations, multilingual, as well as headless and hybrid headless implementations, which we'll talk about quite a bit in this session today as well. What is Universal CMS? Universal CMS for me is a term that I developed that is really about the new paradigm that's emerging in content management systems writ large. One of the things that myself and many other industry watchers and leaders have been watching, especially folks like Dean Barker, who's the author of Web Content Management, is over at Valtech today, is what we call a race to the middle, what he calls a race to the middle. And that is, of course, that hybrid headless CMSs and headless CMSs, these vendors, are increasingly looking very similar to each other. They're increasingly overlapping in their feature sets. And increasingly, they're converging at a point that dotCMS already is at in terms of where we are today with our platform and our product. Universal CMS is meant to move beyond this myopic distinction, this polarized discourse between headless and monolithic. Let's move beyond that and focusing on empowering content teams and developer teams as first-class citizens on any stack, any technology, any channel, any digital experience, any architecture, any infrastructure, and restore the equilibrium between personas that characterize that first CMS generation. One of the things that I like to say is to quote my dear friend and colleague, Ryan Pacchini, who's our VP of Channels and Go-to-Market Strategy. He says content is a team sport. I couldn't agree more, because content is fundamentally, at the end of the day, about how people interact with each other around building digital experiences that are content-driven and serve the end user with content that serves their needs and their requirements. The Universal CMS is about empowering both content teams and developer teams. It's an architectural paradigm. It's also a philosophical paradigm that moves beyond this notion that, headless CMSs are necessarily the way they are, or hybrid headless CMSs are necessarily the way they are, because increasingly neither of them are headless or hybrid headless in their respective segments. But what characterizes a universal CMS architecturally speaking? Well, what I mean by universal CMS is something that's universally developable. That means tech agnostic, any framework, any technology, any stack. Universally editable, meaning something that can be assembled and built and edited in context by any content editor or content practitioner for any channel in a multimodal fashion, which means native mobile, which means websites, so on and so forth. And also that can be deployed anywhere. That doesn't just mean in terms of the limited way that the Mock Alliance wants you to deploy your CMS architecture solely based on their strictures. It means being able to deploy a CMS how you want to, whether that means on a self-hosted implementation architecture, or if that means on the cloud. Or it could also mean you want to use dotCMS also for its headless features and use our headless hosting as well. The universal CMS paradigm is really about moving beyond where we are today with, I would say, a very pitched discussion around headless versus not headless, and restores the familiar equilibrium of the static web era back when we had what I would call a very important handshake between both of these very important personas in the CMS landscape. 7 years ago at DrupalCon Vienna, I shared this slide back when I was at Acquia around some of the challenges that we see between headless CMSs and traditional CMSs. And really what's happening is that content teams and developer teams were increasingly being pitted against each other in this headless versus traditional CMS debate. One of the problems that we see is that content teams increasingly are pressured and are being asked to work with channels that go well beyond what is capable of being done today by CMSs. Most CMSs don't have the ability, for example, to visually edit and visually manage or visually build a mobile app that can work across different platforms and different operating systems. It also means that a lot of CMSs aren't equipped to work with many different JavaScript frameworks. One of the things that we see quite often in the headless CMS space, for example, as well, in addition to the hybrid headless CMS space, is that some CMSs are better than others with certain frameworks than others, which means that some CMSs might be better with React and some might be better with Vue, but some might not be so good with the others that they claim to support. And so this battle between content teams and developer teams is something that we're increasingly watching over the past decade or so, and it's become really a big concern ever since the year 2020, I would say. And it really struck a chord when I wrote an article for CMS Wire called Why We Need a New Grand Compromise in Content Management Systems, in which I shared some of the stories that we've heard from you, our customers, not dotCMS customers, but customers that I've worked with in the past, and also those that I've worked with in the past around their expertise with CMS to learn about the fact that there are a lot of issues around headless CMSs and a lot of issues around how content teams can use CMSs today. So there's a problem here, which is that hybrid headless CMSs out there, those vendors, they're really great for content teams, for editors, but they're really not great for developers anymore. And they're also not really great for things beyond the website. Headless CMSs, well, they're great for developers for everything that's the website and beyond, but they're terrible for editorial teams and content teams. And that's why we need fundamentally a new grand compromise. And the thing is, in the CMS world, what's interesting is the content management system stands alone in the world of software as a CMS, as a software vertical that requires collaboration between personas with very, very different approaches and very, very different incentive structures. As we know here at dotConnect, many of our content teams are working very independently from our developer teams, and as a result, need a great degree of influence and also a great degree of independence from those developer teams to be able to work without being fettered by what the developer teams need to be doing as well. Both teams need to work in parallel, but also need to be able to work independently. And that's what this historic static web CMS of the late 90s and early 2000s afforded us, was the ability for us to have a balance between editorial manipulability and developer manipulability. In short, the ability for editors to work with CMSs was equal to the ability for developers to work with CMSs as well. But what we found now is a bifurcation in the market, a spread in the market between these two segments, headless CMS and hybrid headless CMSs, where we're seeing now that content teams increasingly have their hands tied behind their back in headless CMS implementations, where I've heard of large enterprise organizations, large Fortune 100 or Fortune 500 companies that have now gotten to the point where they've actually reversed track on a lot of their headless CMS implementations because they simply don't have the visual editing features that they need. dotCMS offers you both the visual editing features and the core CMS functionality that you need for both headless and non-headless implementations, regardless of what channel you're trying to target. As we know, one of the things about Universal CMS that I think is really important to note is that architectural purity doesn't trump reality. And as we know, people will use software however they need to and however they would like to. There is no way to hold back developers. There's no way to hold back content teams from doing what they know best and what they want to do best. And this is in response to a lot of the notions that people have about architectural purity or about some of the prescriptions around, for example, the mock alliance, as we've heard from many of the vendors that are in the headless and hybrid headless spaces. What we need to do is to focus on the people that make content tick. We need to focus back on the CMS as a nexus of collaboration between personas, between people with disparate needs, and not on arbitrary concerns like architecture. Because as you've probably thought over the course of the past 15 minutes that I've been speaking as well, many of those who work with our content in our CMSs, especially those of us who are content practitioners or marketing teams or editorial teams, we don't have to care and we shouldn't have to care about the difference between what's headless and what's not because of the fact that it's so graceful all the way. And that's what our Universal Visual Editor provides you. Increasingly now we're seeing a convergence. We're seeing a race to the middle, as my good friend Dean Barker calls it, the author of Web Content Management, towards, of course, the universal CMS paradigm, starting with this convergent evolution towards headless visual editing and a rebundling of architectures, and ending with, of course, a reestablishment of a universal CMS that focuses on a lot of different people's needs. Here are the four key tenets of a universal CMS, in my view. And that is that number one, it should be universally editable. Content teams should be able to edit any content that's destined for any channel and any presentation layer, whether that means the website that you might be managing or multiple websites you might be managing as part of a multi-site architecture. It might mean a mobile app that you might be building in React Native or in Flutter. It might mean also a voice interface you might be building or a chatbot you might be building using a voice interface implementation, using some sort of a framework. But you might also be building for JavaScript websites too, like React and Next.js and Vue.js. All of those channels should be things that editors should be able to visually edit within the context of a CMS. And that's what our Universal Visual Editor provides. Also, universal generability, and that is the ability for content teams to be able to generate any content, any asset, and also developers to generate any code, but also any component. And I'll talk a little bit more about components in just a second here and why components are so important and why it is that Universal CMS is so important in the context of component-driven development and component-driven design for content. But suffice to say that universal generability not only covers the idea of any asset generation and any component generation, but also the ability to use AI and generative AI across a variety of different workflows within dotCMS, which we'll talk about over the course of these 2 days as well. Developer teams also should be able to bring any stack, any technology, any framework, React, Next.js, what have you. Universally developable means that they should be able to bring any framework, any technology, any stack to their CMS implementation. And that's what also our Universal Visual Editor provides, and our SDKs, our software development kits, provide as well. And finally, universal deployability. Many of you use dotCMS for our self-hosted capabilities to be able to use dotCMS in your own environments, in your own context, but also those of us who want to use it with our cloud environments and use cloud platforms to host dotCMS. Cloud Anywhere, for example, our offering for our customers that is increasingly becoming popular as well. And also those of you who are using dotCMS headlessly to use our headless hosting and our headless infrastructure to host your Node.js applications and also your JavaScript framework driven websites and applications as well. So Universal CMS is where we're headed. A new grand compromise is where we're headed right now as well. And it really is kind of mirroring what we've seen in the past. Unfortunately, one of the things that I think and I do believe is that the CMS potentially evolved a little bit early. Originally, back in the day in the early 90s, the late 90s, CMSs were really driven by, of course, file uploads and the concept of a server versus client divide. And the separation of concerns was really completely decimated and destroyed by Universal JavaScript, the development of Node.js, which allowed, of course, for developers to create JavaScript applications straddling both server-side and client-side. For those of you who are not developers, this is really about the development of things like React and Next.js and Angular and some of these hot keywords that you've heard over the course of the past few years. Headless CMS is really developed from this idea that this kind of separation of concerns between a content management system and JavaScript components should be codified. But the problem, of course, with that kind of approach is that it really ties a lot of folks' hands behind their back. In instituting an architectural separation of concerns, what headless CMSs have done is to establish a functional separation of concerns that ties their hands behind their back in terms of being able to interact with developer teams in a rich way. What I mean by that is headless CMSs unfortunately have this problem where we have a functional separation of concerns between content teams and developer teams. Now that content teams are told by developer teams and architects and prescriptive CMS prognosticators that they should be using a headless architecture and they should hand over control over key content workflows to developers. A lot of our content teams and marketing teams and editorial teams here in the room are probably raising your hands in absolute disgust and fear because of the fact, of course, that key workflows are now no longer the domain of your expertise within the context of the headless CMS generation. Things like preview and approval, editorial workflows, templates and layouts, and also, of course, regulatory and accessible compliance as well. What we need, of course, is a universal CMS that allows for us as content teams, as editors, and also those of us who want to work with developers in a rich way to share concerns across both the presentation layers that we want to actually access and target, which could be anything out there, a native mobile app, as we know, a React app, a website, so on and so forth, but also allows us to access all of the workflows that we've been able to before. And in so doing, actually obviating the architectural separation of concern and the functional separation of concerns that has made content teams so much less enabled and less empowered in the context of CMS architectures. What we want is cross-functional concerns, and we want for cross-functional concerns to be things that are co-owned and co-manageable by both editors and developers. And that's, in short, where the universal CMS comes from as a vision. Many of the people in the world of CMS and also in content and commerce and also in digital experiences writ large have agreed with me on this topic. Filip Rakowski, for example, who is the co-founder of Alakai, who is what was formerly known as Vue Storefront, agrees with me. He says modern tools are expected to have end-to-end ownership over the value they deliver rather than ownership of a technical process, which means that you as content teams, you as content marketers, you as CMOs should be able to manage what goes out on any digital channel without having to rely on a single developer on a daily basis. And that's why Universal CMS has gained such traction amongst other vendors like Kenneko as well, who agrees. Dominic Pinted, the CEO of Kenneko, agrees that we need to make people to see the center of CMS again. And we're going to see very soon here a convergence in the market, or as Dean Barker calls it, a race to the middle towards Universal CMS. But let's talk a little bit about what Universal CMS is and what I mean by it. Well, Universal CMS for dotCMS specifically is focused on three key tenets of the Universal CMS approach for dotCMS. And that is, of course, our developer team persona, our content team persona, and our DevOps team persona, which we use to define our product strategy within dotCMS. But we're also focused on three tracks of work. Number one is to allow for developers to bring any technology and any stack to build omni-channel implementations, which means it could be a static website like we have right now with our Velocity pattern, with JavaScript, which we have right now with our headless SDKs and our headless tooling, native mobile apps, which we will soon have with React Native and Flutter-focused tooling, and also web renderable approaches like WebXR for augmented and virtual reality, and also omni-channel approaches like voice and chatbot, which will increasingly allow for developers to access rich ways to build experiences that will also figure in the browser and thus also in the context of the CMS, thus allowing content teams to collaborate richly with developer teams in the context of those software tools as well, using, for example, our universal visual editor, which is, of course, our visual builder and visual editor for both editing and also soon generating anything anywhere across all channels, text, assets, like images, and also, of course, soon code. But also within this idea of universal generation, this idea of universal generativity within dotCMS, we're focused around extending our .ai capabilities, which you already might have heard of from earlier this year, to focus around the ability to actually use dotCMS across a variety of different workflows using generative AI prompts such that you could accelerate your interactions with dotCMS and shorten your time in dotCMS and shorten your time to live for your content. And finally, of course, we're focused a lot at dotCMS on the ability to use our headless hosting, our cloud hosting, our self-hosted approach as well as our cloud anywhere infrastructural approaches too. One of the things that we've heard from other folks about Universal CMS, those who have jumped on the bandwagon, so to speak, like Dominic Pinted, is that we know that headless CMS was progress, but it was not complete. It was incomplete, as my dear colleague and friend, Ryan Picchini, our VP of Channels and GTM Strategy, likes to say. It was incomplete. It simply did not acknowledge something that Ryan also likes to say, which is that content is a team sport. And as I always say, content is about people. And as Dominic Pinter says, we need to make people the center of CMS again, because that's who our content ultimately serves. And that means by serving people through four different conduits of universality within the CMS. Universal editability, namely through omni-channel and multimodal visual editing for any channel that you can imagine, for websites, mobile apps in React Native or Flutter, websites and web apps also that could be built in static site generators or built in server-side rendered frameworks like Next.js, Vue.js, React, Astro, Svelte, Angular, so on and so forth, but also other channels that we know that you're focused on building in the future for digital experience as well, and that you know that you want to use dotCMS as a single source of truth for content for, namely things like digital signage, set-top boxes, over-the-top applications, in-store displays and kiosks, extended reality interfaces like augmented and virtual reality, and finally, of course, voice interfaces, chatbots, and other conversational interfaces and conversational content. Also, for developer teams, we also know that we need to focus on enabling developers to use dotCMS in very rich ways as part of a headless architecture. But that doesn't mean just as a React implementation. That doesn't just mean just for Vue.js developers. It means for every single JavaScript framework out there that's in common use today. That means that we're focusing at dotCMS on enabling developers equally across React, Next.js, Vue.js, Angular, Astro, and Svelte ecosystems, and also focusing on cross-platform frameworks for native mobile applications like React Native and Flutter, and also looking to enable in the future over the course of 2025 and years moving forward, web renderable approaches for omni-channel and multimodal digital experiences like WebXR, using frameworks like Babylon.js, WebAssembly, and of course, also frameworks for conversational interfaces and other omni-channel digital experiences. But these all require more and richer developer ecosystems and developer experiences. And that's why at dotCMS, we're focused around not only enabling developers from an API standpoint, and also not only enabling them from a software development kit standpoint, which is increasingly table stakes and increasingly baseline for CMSs today, but also around generators of code and example code, which also brings me, of course, to the idea of deploying that code and allowing for dotCMS to be something that is deployed not only on your own on-premise or self-hosted infrastructure or on your own desired cloud provider that's outside of our dotCMS designated hosting, but also using things like our headless hosting or other hosting providers like our tech partners in the hosting world to do things like hosting your mobile apps in app stores, to host other applications that you might be building in other omni-channel or other multimodal environments or other digital experiences in Netlify and Vercel, for example. And of course, also what you know and love already with our existing hosting platform and capabilities around Cloud Anywhere and self-hosting. But universal generation and generative AI is where we're headed next as well. And this is really focused around not only generating any asset and any component within a digital experience, but also using our workflows in increasingly rich ways through prompts within dotCMS, including through potentially, as we'll see in 2025, a co-pilot approach. What this means, however, of course, as well, is that we're looking ahead beyond just text and assets and code, which is where a lot of our competitors are focused, to look at things like components and layouts and templates and AI agents for driving workflow acceleration within CMS interactions that you might have within content teams. And also, of course, things that we know are increasingly focused on by marketing teams and content teams as well, landing pages and microsites, so that you don't need to be toiling with a CMS for not only a developer standpoint, but also from a content team standpoint as well. We also want to work at dotCMS to disrupt ourselves before we are disrupted and before the CMS itself is disrupted as well. And that's why we're working on looking at some of the ways in which AI will influence the CMS in the future, including around form management and even potentially full front-end generation too. And that's it. That's the overview. It's a quick rundown of Universal CMS, our vision here at dotCMS, our vision for the dotCMS rendition of Universal CMS, and also where we expect the CMS world to go in the future and why we want you along for the ride as customers and as those who are looking at dotCMS. Because as we move beyond headless, beyond monolithic towards a world where content is really about making people the center of CMS again, and also allowing us to build these rich experiences of the future, we're really talking about the CMS of tomorrow and content management of the future. And that's why we are here to herald and declare officially the next era of content management, which is the universal CMS, and dotCMS is here to help you through that journey, through the next period of history of CMS. With that, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of dotConnect.